Right, now we're going to pass over to Matt, our General Secretary, who's going to speak to you.
Need to mute it. Is that on? No. Hello, hello. I'll have to hold it. Well, good morning, everyone. Great to see so many people here and online. And thanks for Damien for that very detailed explanation of where we are in terms of the STRB. And I think although we represent members in under different governments with different systems, and in different in the independent sector, I do think what's happening to teachers in state-funded schools in England is key, because that's where the bulk of our members are, and it will therefore affect everything else. Teachers' pay in England will have an impact on everything else, and it will also, as I'll come on to, have an impact on every other aspect of our members' working lives, because it's not just about pay, it's about the funding of education and jobs and other plans that the government has. So I think we need to think as a union about what are the aspirations and aims of our members that are reflected in the discussions you have in the workplace, at your local associations, that we then have at our conference, that sets our policy, that sets the agenda that we try to pursue. And if you like, that's the aims of the union. But how does that fit into what's going on in the bigger world? You know, that might be operate at different levels in terms of dealing with head teachers, dealing with academy trusts, and in terms of the issues we're discussing today, dealing with governments. So we need to think about how we interact with government, what government policies are, what the constraints on those policies are. And regrettably, lots of things in education, lots of things for all trade unions come back to money. Ultimately, how much money is going into education? Is education adequately funded? What's our assessment of the funding of education? What's our assessment of what happened under the last government and what this government is saying? And then from there, and I think the question was asked earlier, where do we go ourselves in terms of campaigning and considering our options, which at some point might also include issues around industrial action and so on. So I think that's how I wanted to approach this, that pay, jobs, workload, funding, the discussions that are emerging, and the forthcoming white paper on schools, which will address issues around SEND, I think are also part of that bigger picture. So just looking at that at a high level to begin with, in terms of government policy, we've had just over 18 months or so of a new government, and a number of colleagues in the room were at the TUC, and you may have followed what the TUC debated and discussed. So the TUC represents just over 6 million affiliated trade union members. So in terms of civil society, it's the biggest voluntary organisations that exist in society. It's where workers are organised. We're affiliated, as are other trade unions. And the TUC meets every September and discusses the agendas that different unions bring to that. And one thing that struck me attending the conference this September was that how rapidly there was an air of, frankly, disillusionment about the government. I don't know what you're interested in your own reflections, what colleagues are saying, but I think the comments that what I picked up, and it's probably my own reflection as well, is that at the general election, people voted for a change. People had experienced almost 15 years of austerity. And if you look at historically, since the Second World War, an unprecedented period of, for example, take teachers' pay and other public sector workers' pay, an unprecedented period of time that pay was held back for by central government policy, but also that there were attacks on pensions, there were cuts in funding that meant there were significant job losses in education and elsewhere in the public sector. So the public services are in many cases on their knees. Education has suffered. It's probably not actually the worst part of public expenditure. I would guess local government is probably the worst hit area of local government, where you're seeing increasingly local councils on the actually in or on the verge of bankruptcy, and not providing even statutory responsibilities are not being met in many local authorities. So that's the scale of what we've faced over the previous 14 and a half years, and people voted for a change. And I read an article, I think in The Guardian the other week, where someone described the experience of the Labour government as people wanting fundamental change, but the approach of the Starmer government being people as though people just wanted a slightly more efficient plumber to sort out the detail. I.e., they have an approach that the grown-ups are in the room, we're more efficient, we're more managerial, and the question is whether that is actually delivering what people want. And you can see the scale of that disillusionment in the growth of the opinion poll reflections of the growth of support, for example, for reform. And we now have reform running a number of county councils across the country, expected to do well in the May elections, expected to make gains in Wales in the Welsh elections, in England, English local government. So we will have more and more influence of what was once seen as a beyond the pale point of view, actually becoming increasingly in the mainstream. And I think we have to be measured on this. It's a long way off. A lot can happen between now and a general election. But certainly, if you look at opinion polls today, the possibility of a government led possibly by Nigel Farage. And just to give you a flavour of some of that in terms of public sector policy, and I'm not saying that is going to happen at all. As I say, there's a lot to happen between now and a general election. But take the question of just one issue, public sector pensions. You've all been through public sector pension changes, which have worsened the position for millions of people working in the public sector, and people are worse off as a result of that. The reform approach is actually that there shouldn't be defined benefit pensions existing anywhere. But they've all been scrapped in the private sector. So why should public sector workers have them as well? So you can see the prospect for further conflict if that was to come. I think we're dealing with an entirely new situation if that was to come about. As I say, that's a long way off. We're dealing with the current Labour government, and just want to say just a few words about that. I think it's acknowledged, and I think we can acknowledge it as well, that there is certainly an attempt, quite a significant attempt by the new government to engage more with trade unions, and that's without a doubt, and I think that's felt across the board. I think that's we can say that. So in England, the government has set up this body called Improving Education Together, which is a broad, what they call nowadays a stakeholder body. So it includes all the trade unions, it includes employers' representatives, it includes the DfE, and the Secretary of State chairs it. So we've got a direct input on policy issues with the Secretary of State. I think there are similar developments elsewhere in public services, and that is to be welcomed. And there's no, from 14 plus years where governments tried not to talk to unions at all if they could get away with it, that is a welcome change, and we should acknowledge that. I think just on a personal assessment, I think Bridget Phillipson is a genuine person who wants to see improvements to education and wants to talk to us about all of that, and we should welcome that and engage with that. But the big but is the question actually of funding and how far people are willing to go, and also on the fundamentals about the issues that were touched on about how do academized schools who are state funded deal with issues like teachers' pay and conditions and the recognition of trade unions. And when we get onto those areas, it is more problematic, because the truth is that no matter how well-meaning Bridget Phillipson is, behind Bridget Phillipson sits the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister, and they have set out very clear and firm guidelines on spending. And I'll come on to that in a bit more detail in terms of education spending. But take one question about trade union recognition. And we actually took the opportunity at the TUC, where the Secretary of State attended as a guest, and an NASUWT delegate specifically asked the question, will you make it a requirement that Academy Trusts recognise trade unions? And Bridget's answer was, well, under the Employment Rights Bill, trade unions will have stronger rights, which wasn't actually answering the question that was asked, and is a classic politician's answer. And yeah, in theory, the Employment Rights Bill should make it easier for trade unions to be recognised. What it doesn't address is the questions that we're really asking in a frankly fragmented and academized system. Will you take more steps to bring central state control effectively over the academized sector, including on trade union recognition, on facility time, and on pay and conditions? And I think on that front, we face a much bigger challenge, and it's not as straightforward as we might hope. I think want to then move on to developing some of the points that Damien outlined in terms of pay and how that fits into the question of what we do. Because I think, and I would urge people to read the union submission. I think we can be very proud, you can be very proud of the teams here who prepare all that work that we take into the STRB. The work that's been done over many years, making the case about the recruitment and retention crisis, about what's happened to teachers' real earnings during that period. But we need to make sure actually that our members on the ground understand what the union is doing for them in that regard. So I'd be interested in hearing people's views on what's the best way to present that, because I accept people may not want to read an 85% page report, but we do need to find ways of presenting the information that is in that in ways that are appealing to people, easy to read, easy to access. So I'd be interested in people's views on how you think we are best placed to explain that. I think we have some very powerful arguments on teachers' pay, on issues around workload, and we've got great policy and research on all of those points. But then just remind ourselves of some of the things that Damien touched on, of what the government is saying to the pay review body. They are saying that the pay rise should be 6.5% over 3 years, weighted towards the end. So broadly, you can guess that what they're actually recommending, although they don't say the figures in this way, is something like 2%, 2%, 2.5%. So we're talking about a recommendation from government for very low pay rises over the next 3 years, pay rises which will not, if it's what the pay review body accepts, which will not remotely restore the pay that's been lost as set out in Damien's charts. That's where this government, which, as I've said, is a more friendly government than the last government, but that's what even this government is saying about teachers' pay over the next 3 years. It then includes a couple of worrying things, as Damien said, the issue on salary safeguarding and non-consolidated payments. And one thing that struck me, I attended with the president, we attended where we answered some questions to the STRB a couple of weeks ago. And one thing that struck me as someone coming in from the outside on for example, the issue of salary safeguarding, is that currently is a contractual protection, a contractual right that teachers in schools have. and we have a system whereby people can unilaterally come along and potentially, it's not saying they will take it away, but they have the power to take that away without negotiation. And that's quite, to me, as an outsider in a way, is quite shocking, because in other circumstances, employers may want to do something similar, but they would have to say, I tell you what, if you agree to that, we'll give you, for example, an extra 2% on your pay rise. What's being considered here, we potentially take it away without any recompense at all. I'm not saying that's what will happen, but that's what is the sort of thing that is being considered. They then ask views on issues around the working hours of teachers and leaders. Again, a very worrying question, because that's not with a view to reducing the hours of teachers, of working hours of teachers. That's with a view to increasing so-called flexibility for schools and employers to make other demands of teachers. So there are some worrying things. I think the most important thing is in the government's letter to the STRB to be very clear that there is no additional funding coming for teachers' pay as a result of this process. And I think that leads on to the next point I want to address, which is what are the implications of that for us? Because I've reflected on what happened this year in terms of pay. And if you go back a year, we were discussing a 2.8, a recommendation from central government for 2.8% increase. That actually turned into a 4% actual increase. But the problem, of course, was the funding of that increase. And a quarter of that increase was not funded, which has meant cuts in schools. And you will know better than me the detail of how that's played out. But it means, and it will depend, it's varied school by school, but it has meant that some schools have really suffered as a result of that pay rise. And we will have seen job losses. And if you think about the job losses then exacerbate the workload problem on the other staff in school, including the teachers. So if we pull all that together, I think the problem that we face for the next 3 years, certainly for the next 2 years and probably for the next 3 years, is the risk of low pay rises, which may be below inflation. And there, as was said earlier, there are different ways of measuring inflation, but low pay rises, which may be below inflation, which are, I think, highly likely not to do anything to significantly restore the pay which is lost, which is our policy, coming back to our policy point. But also this dilemma that if the STRB doesn't agree with the government and awards a higher or recommends a higher award, and then if the government agrees to that, that will exacerbate the funding crisis in schools, because anything above the 2% is going to be unfunded and will lead to further cuts in schools, job losses, and so on. And then, as Damien said, I might have some good news, but I don't really. And then on top of that, we have another policy issue, which I think we need to address, and I'm sure is on people's minds, and that's the forthcoming schools white paper and the question of SEND. And again, it's been interesting to follow that, because almost since, I took up post as the acting general secretary in April, was elected in July, and throughout that whole period, there has been discussion about this white paper which is coming. And I've been to numerous meetings where people have spoken about the white paper which is coming, and which has then been delayed, and which has then been delayed again. And what has struck me in the meetings I've sat in with DfE officials is that there is a huge nervousness from government about that white paper, because if you saw, even I think it was back in October, November, even an initial discussion around it prompted a huge reaction from parents. And it is clear the governments are very, very worried about a reaction from parents, and probably about the reaction from teachers and school staff as well, which is why they have not yet published it, and we don't know the full details of that. But there is this theme about inclusion and mainstreaming, And of course, like in many things, the devil is in the detail. What do you mean by that? What are the mechanisms by which you will aim to do that? There may be good ideas in that, but actually it comes down to the reality. And we've made this point in all the work streams leading up to this, is what does this really mean for the staff in the school? What does this mean for the classroom teacher in the school? And is there going to be adequate support, training, resourcing, and most notably staffing to support the aims that you set out? And I think the big worry, and I made this point in a meeting with Bridget Phillipson about a month ago, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I picked this up from my travels around the country and from the national executive, that I said to Bridget, I think the biggest feeling I get from teachers and from our reps is actually that they're quite worried about this, of what this will actually mean in reality. And there is no great enthusiasm that this is coming along, because the fear is it will not be adequately funded and it will therefore exacerbate the problems we already face. I didn't really get a response to that, but they will see in the spring. I think this is going to be a big political debate in the spring and beyond, for education, but I think it's going to be much wider. It's going to be a big political debate in the spring as well. So if we pull all that together, and this is where I think the challenges for NASUWT for 2026, we've had a difficult 15 years. We face a prospect that people hoped that austerity was ending, and certainly government says austerity is ended or is ending, but actually the reality doesn't actually fully bear that out. There is an easing up, things may be marginally better, but it does not address our questions about pay, about staffing, about funding, and therefore about workload. And I think those four elements pulled together raise the challenges that we need to think about. And I think this is probably the biggest single challenge that we face for 2026 and beyond, as a union, to think through what this means, how we prepare. And I'll try and just draw this to a close on this. If you think about, many of you will have been at our conference in April. A resolution was passed that said if pay rise was below inflation, we should move to a ballot. Things turned out slightly differently because the pay award was higher than had been expected. But I think exactly the same problem that was faced at conference this year is going to be faced at conference in the coming year. And my feeling is that we need to be thinking now, long in advance of conference, about what we do to prepare for that situation. But saying to members, this is not simply about what pay rise you get. This is also about the funding of your school, the support you're given in your school, how, if it is done, how SEND reforms are introduced and whether they are adequately funded, and whether you are given the adequate support, training and resources that would be necessary to do that, or whether we have other models and arguments to make as part of that discussion, and that actually all of those things are linked. You can't separate the one from the other. They are all linked, including the workload issues, and that we need to prepare for a major campaign to make our case. And that may involve us, we'll regularly sit down with ministers and put our case to the ministers. Well, actually, that's not sufficient. We can put the best case in the world. What we need to show is that there are thousands of teachers on the ground who are saying, you need to listen to our union. You need to discuss with our union if you want to do these things. And you need to reconsider what we think is the underfunding of education. You need to put more money into education if you really want to create an education service fit for 2026 and beyond. and we need to do that. So we've discussed some of these issues at the National Executive. We have already, and by the way, I'm not saying this is where we will end. We will end up, but we need to prepare for all eventualities. So we are doing work to address questions around our membership database. We will need, you know the rules on balloting, for example, that we need accurate details of every member. We need their current address. We need their current school and employer. We need all those details up to date. Those are the things on which you can fall down if you do get into that situation. So we're starting that discussion about that preparation. And then just picking up the point about the media, that was the question about the media that was asked. I think we're in the strongest point to make our case to go to the media when we are all clear ourselves that we're agreed. We may not agree on every dot and comma of everything we're saying, but when we're broadly agreed on a direction of travel that we're in, that this is where we're going, this is our assessment of the situation, we're discussing that with our members, this is where we want to be, and we are working together in that direction. I think that puts us in a very strong position to then say to the government, to the media, to whoever, we've got a point of view to express on behalf of teachers that needs to be heard. And the final point is there's no shortcut to this. The only answer is to have those discussions with our members in schools, to tell them the work that we've done and to hear their views, and to tell them what we've said about pay and hear their views, to tell them what we've said about workload and to hear their views, and then out of that to develop a campaign that's organised all across the country that builds a powerful voice on behalf of teachers to make the case that the government needs to listen to us, needs to take account of the experience of frontline teachers, and needs to put the resources in that does properly address pay, but also all those other issues about staffing levels and workload. And I think this is probably the central challenge we face for 2026 and beyond. Thank you.